Hi, so before I read this book for you, I just want to put a disclaimer. This is a book that I have not written. It's a book that I'm reading and decided to take you along with me. There could be some things that trigger certain people within this book, talking about violence or things that maybe you might find offensive. So before you watch this video, make sure that you're aware that you may not like or appreciate everything that's said in this book, but this is just a disclaimer for you, so don't feel angry if you decide to listen and you don't like what you hear. Hello, welcome friends. Welcome to my channel. My name is Mo Moon. I am doing a video today that you can just leave on in the background. You don't have to watch me. I'm not going to be doing anything exciting. There's nothing that you're going to miss if you don't watch the video, but if you want to put me on in the background, you can do that. I've been wanting to read this book called Vampires: The Myths, Legends, and Lore, and it's by Charlotte Montague. It's a book called Vampires, and there are just a second here. So there are 5 chapters in the book, and each chapter has about 5 to 8 subtitles. And each subtitle is like a little chapter in itself. And I've been wanting to read this book since I bought it, and I figured that maybe you guys and girls would be interested in hearing about the lore, myths, and legends of vampires. I know I have a series called My Vampire Diary, and I'm hoping to continue to do that. But right now I'd like to start reading this book for you and for myself as well. And I figured it'll take me, if I do a chapter, not a full chapter, but a subtitle within the chapter, if I do a subtitle within the chapter twice a week, it would take me about 3 months doing it twice a week to get through the whole book. But we'll see as we go. I don't know if I'm going to actually do a reading twice a week or maybe just once a week. But this is an easier type of video because I don't really have to set up to record it. It's just something that I take out my video camera and my cell phone, I should say, and the book and start to read to you. So without further explanation, let's read this book. Let's start reading this book called Vampires: The Myths, Legends, and Lore by Charlotte Montague. So we're starting with the introduction. So like I said, feel free to put me on in the background while you're doing your kitchen work or you're cleaning or driving in your car or whatever you're doing. And let's start this introduction to this vampires book. The legend of the vampire has never been more popular than it is today. Millions of copies of Stephenie Meyer's Twilight series have been sold, and the vampire continues to be represented in many imaginative forms on stage and screen, whether in the theater, in film, on TV, or in the field of popular music. On the internet, entire websites are devoted to the cult of the vampire, discussing details of lifestyle, dress, and beliefs. In most cases, this fascination with the myth is harmless enough. It is simply a playful and enjoyable way for us to address some of our most confusing and difficult experiences in life, such as our fear of death, our longing for immortality, and our mixed feelings about becoming sexual beings as we grow up. However, there are instances in which the figure of the vampire attracts those with more evil intent, or those who suffer from various forms of mental illness. These are the individuals who take the legend literally and begin to act accordingly. The devotees, past or present, known and feared for their bloodthirsty ways or their bizarre ritual practices. In this book, we will be looking at all of these manifestations of the vampire myth, from its genesis in folklore to its status today as one of the most iconic figures in popular culture. We will try to find out how this strange creature, who came into being centuries ago as a minor figure in an obscure pagan belief system, that of the old religion of the Slavic countries, eventually managed to dominate the Gothic imagination of the Victorians and beyond, in the process transforming itself from a hideous monster into the suave villain we know today. The origins of the vampire legend go back centuries to the dark forests of Transylvania and the pagan beliefs of the Slavic peoples. They are shrouded in mystery since the religious practices of these people were not written down, but we know that vampire folklore dominated the lives of rural peasants and priests during the Middle Ages. In particular, these communities were concerned with death and disease. At a time when medicine was in its infancy and superstition was rife, the idea of the revenant coming back from the grave to wreak revenge on the living was highly potent and struck deep fear into the largely uneducated population of the time. Although Christianity had been introduced into these countries, peasant folklore still retained their pagan beliefs. Among these was the idea that after death, the souls of those who had suffered in life or who had committed crimes were condemned to wander the earth forever alone and shunned by human society. This exclusion from love and life was thought to give the dead a deep resentment of the living, causing their spirits to rise from the grave as vampires. It was believed that these malign beings would make their way to villages and towns, bringing with them plagues and fatal diseases from the grave. In the medieval imagination, the vampire was a vile, corpse-like being, swollen with the blood and with its flesh rotting, whose revolting smell brought a foul pestilence into the streets where it walked at night, looking for victims. Today, this notion of the vampire as a lonely, reviled figure continues to be part of the myth. Other aspects of the medieval myth, such as the idea of the vampire as a bringer of plague from the dead, have become less important. This is perhaps because we now have access to medical science and the process whereby the human body decomposes after death is better understood. The characteristics that so frightened the medieval peasant, such as bloating and swelling of the body, with fresh blood running out of the orifices, have been scientifically explained. In addition, the ways in which communicable diseases are spread are better understood, so that most of us no longer believe when an epidemic breaks out that a vampire may be responsible. Over the centuries, the vampire myth, originating from the Slavic countries, began to spread throughout Europe, fueled by tales of vampire sightings. In some cases, government officials were sent to quell panic in a remote area, only to come back with accounts of priests opening up graves to find bodies that had swelled and grown fat with ruddy cheeks and blood running from their mouths, their hair and fingernails grown long while they sojourned underground. These sensational stories were reported in the newspapers, thrilling and horrifying the general population. In this way, the more literate classes of the 18th century began to become fascinated by vampires, and by the 19th, they had made their way into literature and art. The vampire legend particularly appealed to the Gothic taste of the Victorians, who reveled in the tales of gloomy castles, northern forests, and evil ghouls lying in wait for innocent travelers. In this period, the most famous vampire of them all, Count Dracula, was born. He was the brainchild of Bram Stoker, whose refined aristocratic bloodsucker caught the public imagination. Some cultural historians have argued that the figure of Dracula was a metaphor for the parasitic existence of the upper classes and their dependence on poverty, stricken and brutally treated lower orders. Whether or not this was the reason for the Count's popularity, Stoker's novels spawned a whole host of imitators, and in the 20th century went on to inspire new generations of artists, writers, and filmmakers. Today's vampire is a very different creature from the monster of the medieval imagination, or even the ghoulish aristocrat of Victorian horror stories. In modern novels and films, the status of the vampire as, on the surface, indistinguishable from normal human beings is emphasized. Vampires are also characterized as having human emotions, that is, falling in love, feeling the pain of separation, loss, and vilification, and most importantly, being anguished about their predicament as undead beings from the grave, excluded from human society, and responsible for corrupting the lovers and friends with whom they form attachments. In this way, the modern vampire myth speaks to our ambiguous feelings about individuals who are traditionally excluded in our society. For example, drug users, people with unusual sexual orientations, and the mentally ill. It also resonates with deep-seated fears, especially among young people, that passionate sexual feelings may arouse violence and do harm to those we love. In modern times, the vampire myth continues to be a powerful metaphor for sexual initiation, expressing fears and desires about sexual experience as part of the process of growing up. It appeals in particular to teenage girls who now devour vampire books and films with enormous enthusiasm. There are different arguments as to why this is so. Some psychologists have argued that the biting aspect of the vampire myth is a form of infantile sexuality brought into play in the teenage years so as to avoid the realities of sexual intercourse. Be that as it may, there is no doubt that the idea of the handsome young vampire, who is also hundreds of years old and has several lifetimes worth of experience, is an immensely attractive figure to many young women. As the tremendous success of the Twilight series, both in book and film form, attest. But what of the vampire legend worldwide? The myth is not only present in European folklore, literature, and modern media, but is also found in different forms all over the world. In almost all cultures of the globe, revenant stories exist, and many of them involve the central element of the vampire myth, which is the drinking of blood. From earliest times, there have been stories of vampire-like creatures, such as the blood-sucking Lamia of ancient Greece and Lilith, the seductive storm demon of Mesopotamia who brings disease and death. The Romans believed in the Strix, an evil nocturnal bird who fed on flesh like the vampire, while the Aztecs feared the Cihuateteo, the spirits of women who had died in childbirth, who haunted crossroads, eager to seize young children and carry them off. From Africa comes the Asanbosam, a vampire-like creature believed to have iron teeth and to live in trees, swooping down to attack its victims. And from the Philippines, the Aswang, a female bat-like spirit who eats the dead and steals children. There are also contemporary vampire stories in many parts of the developing world that in some cases have acquired the status of urban myths. Today in Puerto Rico and Mexico, there are communities who still believe in the chupacabra, the goat sucker who attacks herds of livestock and drinks their blood. Sightings of this bizarre creature, said to be the size of a small bear with a row of spines that run along its back from head to tail, have been reported in many different parts of the Americas. Whether they are true or false, it is hard to say, but what is clear is that all these vampire myths bear witness to universal human anxieties about death, about what happens to us after we die, and how the spirits of the departed, especially those who have experienced suffering or mistreatment, may return to haunt us. Most of us see the vampire legend as an entertaining, perhaps somewhat disturbing, form of horror fiction. However, there are certain individuals, both historical and contemporary, for whom vampirism becomes a way of life. These are the people who take the myth to an extreme, killing to satisfy their lust for blood. In the past, people who showed violent, bloodthirsty, and often severely mentally ill behaviors might be thought of as vampires. Indeed, serial killers, as we would call them today, were quite often dubbed vampires. For example, Peter Kruten, the serial killer known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf, who murdered and tortured children, and Richard Trenton Chase, who after killing 6 people in California in 1977, was nicknamed the Vampire of Sacramento because he drank his victims' blood and ate parts of their internal organs. The forerunners of these serial killer vampires are infamous historical figures such as Vlad the Impaler, Gilles de Rais, and Countess Elizabeth Bathory. These were the serial killers of their day, men and women who loved to kill for their perverse pleasure that horrific act of cruelty gave them. What is most shocking about these killers is that they were powerful members of the ruling class and therefore were allowed to kill hundreds of victims more or less with impunity. The most infamous of all, perhaps, is Vlad, who had a barbarous habit of skewering people on sharpened stakes, sometimes hundreds at a time, including infants and their mothers. Gilles de Rais, another brutal military man, was a Breton knight and companion of Joan of Arc, who seemed to have lost his mind and became a sadistic serial killer of children. In both these cases, the day-to-day killing of human beings on the field of combat seemed to have sparked off a thirst for blood that could not be quenched. And finally, there is perhaps the most shocking case of all, the viciously insane Countess Elizabeth Bathory, who tortured and killed hundreds of young women in her remote Hungarian castle, and who has gone down in history as the most prolific female serial killer of all time. Real vampires, then, are anything but entertaining. They show us the dark side of the myth and the horror that may ensue when a deranged individual takes it literally and acts upon it. By contrast, the vampires of imagination in popular culture through the ages have been a staple of the horror genre, providing an endless source of inspiration for poets, writers, filmmakers, and artists. Beginning with the Romantics, we find the first vampire to make their appearance in English literature. In the works of such masters as John Keats, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Lord Byron, whose friend and physician, John Polidori, wrote the seminal story The Vampire, published in 1819. The Victorian vampire craze in literature continued with such figures as Varney the Vampire, the sympathetic hero of the penny dreadfuls, cheap serial editions of horror stories aimed at teenagers. Varney is one of the first sympathetic literature vampires, described as essentially human and to some degree humane, but suffering from a horrible condition that compels him to seek blood from his victims to survive. This theme later becomes central to vampire literature until in contemporary stories the figure of the vampire stands as a metaphor for an ordinary individual afflicted by destructive sexual drives that he or she cannot control and that inspire self-loathing, guilt, and disgust. In this portrayal, we feel sympathy for the vampire and are able to empathize with his or her condition. There is an early forerunner of the lesbian vampire story in another Victorian classic, Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, a tale of repressed desire between two young women that thrilled Victorian readers with its combination of gothic horror, forbidden romance, and sexual innuendo. We then encounter the greatest vampire novel of all time, Bram Stoker's Dracula, which brings together all these strands in a narrative of drama, passion, and power. We explore some of the profound themes of the novel, such as the conflict between belief in the rational, science, medicine, and technology, and the irrational, ancient folkloric beliefs in supernatural forces such as spirits and demons. We also find out where Stoker got his inspiration for the story, and most importantly, how he created the character of the most famous vampire in literature, Count Dracula. In the 20th and 21st century, vampire fiction continues apace with novels such as Richard Matheson's I Am Legend in the 1950s, to Anne Rice's seminal Vampire Chronicles beginning in the 1970s, to today's massively popular Twilight series by Stephenie Meyer. In the cinema, too, the vampire becomes a staple of the horror genre, beginning with F.W. Murnau's cult classic Nosferatu in 1922, based on Stoker's novel, and continuing with such milestones as Dracula in 1931, starring Bela Lugosi, and the Hammer horror series starring Christopher Lee, which commenced in 1958. We also visit the vampires of popular television, including Barnabas Collins on the ABC TV series Dark Shadows and Buffy Summer of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. The vampires of popular music are not forgotten, as we remember such iconic figures as Screamin' Jay Hawkins, who emerged from a smoke-filled coffin on stage, complete with cape and voodoo cane, and his musical progeny, Alice Cooper, stalwart of the rock and roll horror genre, who introduced a further element of mayhem onto the stage with mock executions by electric chair, gallows, and guillotine. In the same vein is today's Marilyn Manson, who continues to wave the banner for heavy metal and tasteless gore, and whose antics are perennially censored by the authorities in the finest rock tradition. Today it seems that our long love affair with the vampire, if it can be termed as such, looks set to continue. The vile monster from the grave that plagued the medieval imagination has, in the new millennium, been replaced by a more sympathetic, sensitive, and humane character. Today, the vampire stands as a metaphor for the civilized, cultured human being who is still, at heart, prey to dark, irrational forces that he or she cannot always control. It is as if, in the figure of the vampire, the human race preserves a memory of our ancient pagan culture and refuses to let go of it, recognizing its continuing power to express our ever-present primitive fears and hopes about the nature of death, life, death, and immortality. So that's the introduction for vampires, the myth, legends, and lore. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed listening to me starting to read this book, Vampires, the Myth, Legends, and Lore. Thank you for coming along with me. I wouldn't be so apt to reading this book if it wasn't being recorded for you. Let me know how you feel about me reading this book for you. I know it might not be interesting to watch, but maybe it's interesting to listen to. I'm sorry if you feel offended by anything that was said in the book. I will put a disclaimer at the beginning of the video though, so that before you listen, well, anyways, it's not important. Again, my name is Mo Moon. I hope you enjoy this video. If you did, leave it a thumbs up, comment anything you would like about what I've read down below. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And please as well, if you do subscribe, hit the notification bell to know when I upload a new video. If you've already subscribed to my channel, thank you so much. I appreciate your support, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.